So you wanted to start with a statement first.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I have to commend this effort. It is important that the country and even the world understands what FVR did during his 6 years in office. And there's many who criticize him. I'm not here to criticize him. I'm here to show aspects of his leadership which has always been exemplary for all people. I'll give you one example. We were on a state visit, the first to Malaysia. And overnight, we stayed up all night talking about our relations with Malaysia, which was not very good. The next day, we get into a car and we were going to Istana or wherever the Prime Minister was. He called me aside and says, I want to have a four eyes meeting with the Prime Minister. I said, sir, that's not allowed. You gotta have interpreters or note takers. No, you make it happen. I said, okay. So I ran to the ambassador and the ambassador was in my car. I said, the president wants a four eyes meeting. He says, no, that can't be done. He will never agree. So we were led in and the ambassador left me immediately, ran up the stairs. As we went up the stairs with the official party of the president, they directed FVR to one room and the rest of us to another room, which basically means Mahathir agreed. And after 30 minutes or something like that, the president came out and he looked at me and says, ayos na. And after that, in reality, relationship was never better. I think that's an example of a leader knows what the problem is and he responds to it with sometimes feel is unorthodox. Well, he did it. Another example of leadership is when we were in the Netherlands and we were going through these pickets shouting and giving the finger to the president, and they were so-called blonde-eyed Filipinos doing this as he was going to give an address there. And he just said to me, smile, do nothing else, and told Navarro and I, stand by my side behind me. He even set the picture. And then we moved forward. And he read his speech. It never affected him. And we went after to the hotel. He was very calm. I mean, that to me is the mark of leadership. And I have to say that I have never seen such command of what was the situation. It's not just that he was a general. He was also leading the country, and he did what was best for the country. That's all I really have to say. All I can say is he was a true leader. And what we need today is a true leader who knows the world about him and responds accordingly and is not parochial in his interpretation of things.
He knew exactly where to take Philippine Foreign Relations Secretary.
Absolutely. He understood foreign relations and he addressed it frontally, and he also understood that he had to talk to the rest of the world and not just to our allies like the United States. He visited all of the Middle East because he was worried about the overseas Filipino. He went to Europe to make sure Europe understands his position. He even went to Russia. And so nobody would say that we didn't know what was going on because our leader made us aware. And that's also the importance of having a head of state going around the world and showing what the Philippines has to offer or what the Philippines needs. And he did all of that.
He turned negatives into positives. Well,
the best example is Malaysia, in my opinion.
Right. And exactly. Our relations have never been so great. We had trouble with Sabah, and that actually was
resolved in that four eyes. In fact, I'm not quite sure. There's no notes, so we don't really know what happened. To the point that there's another sideline. We went to the Prime Minister's house for dinner, and the two of them sang in the most horrible fashion a duet. But to show you how the Prime Minister warmed up to him. So, it's hard to predict how FVR acted, but always aware what needed to be done for his country.
Secretary, let me go back a few years before that, and let me just point out to the family names, Romulo and Ramos. Family names imbued with the DNA of the DFA. You guys met each other when your fathers were at the Foreign Office.
I think I met the president first when he was a cadet in West Point.
West Point.
Because my father, if I really remember, was the ambassador at the time. And his father was the minister, then, I think under my father. I'm not sure, but I do remember meeting him. The next time I met him already is when he called me from Brussels, where I was ambassador, and asked to meet him in DBP, where he was holding temporary office.
Oh, that was a so
It's
there
a-
were
that's
no.
year-
It's a pretty long stretch.
1992.
Right, right, and he had already become president then.
Elected president.
President elect, right? Tell me, shortly before that, how did the DFA community respond to a Ramos seeking the presidency?
That's not a fair statement to me, because during the time I was the ambassador, I went to the D&D to give him a briefing on what was going on there as far as the NPA was concerned. And I gave him an intelligence briefing. And after that, he kept in touch with me and giving me notes as to what was happening. So, of course, I reacted positively because he was aware that we in Europe had to worry about what was called the left at that time.
Yes.
So the answer is, my reaction was always positive.
So the DFA community was
As far as I'm concerned, and as far
receptive.
as those of us in Europe, yes, I can't speak for DFA at the time.
Okay. He called you to a meeting. Was that when the job offer was made?
He made the job offer to me. Raul Manlapus called me. He says, I want you to come. I want you to talk to the president. And I knew more or less what the offer would be. And he offered me the job to be secretary. And I said, Mr. President, you do me a disservice and yourself a disservice. I don't want to be the secretary. I will offend politicians. I'm not the type. What you should do is appoint me ambassador to Washington, which is what I really want. And he thought about that for 10 seconds. He said, no, you'll be my secretary and we'll decide who will be the ambassador to Washington. So I had no choice. When a president like that, a former general, tells you that's what you're going to do, you just do it.
There's no ifs or buts to that. Any specific directives from him about how you should take on the job or direction?
Well, no, he just said, look, foreign affairs is one of the most important tasks I have. But the important thing is that you convey at all times what is necessary in foreign affairs. And I'll give you an example. He said, I want every day from you and your staff 3 noteworthy items that's of concern. And then I will pick one and come out with a press release on it. No one has ever done that like he did. And he did that with almost every department, which gives you an indication of how he knew what was going on all the time. And we appreciated it. No spokesman would talk out of turn because he was briefed first. And then the spokesman would see what our input is.
Yeah. But tell me, where were we? We weren't in that good a shape insofar as foreign relations were at the start of his term. The relationship with our longest standing ally at the time was shot through with holes. We just rejected the basis agreement. We didn't know where to put the U.S. relationship was. Our ASEAN neighbors were worried about where we were going, or even if we were even moving forward at all. Where were we? Where were we?
Well, I think he has set the record straight there. But as a matter of retrospect, let me just say that once the Senate voted against the bases, all the councils of Philippine embassies in Europe wrote a letter expressing regret that such a decision was made.
Yes.
At least those ambassadors in Europe felt that way. Then Ramos takes over, and I would suggest by his actuations on making a state visit to Washington, started the ball rolling again, that this was the right way to go. And I think by the end of his term, nobody was in doubt as to our relationship, a very important ally, the United States. Even as he said, please remember, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. He's aware of that. But in the world of reality, he knew that at that point in time, the United States was the true ally.
Yeah, right. And he stayed with them. Huh? But at the same time, Secretary, if you remember, the first round of visits was in the neighborhood.
That's
ASEAN.
traditional.
Yeah, traditional.
That's traditional.
But at the same time, it wasn't just as previous presidents had done, protocol, traditional. He came with, in the case of Malaysia, in the case of Singapore, in the case of Thailand, he came prepared. Tell me about how those preparations were insofar as all these visits.
Let me just say that the department played its share in briefing him, particularly in the case of Malaysia, Sabah, etc. And as it turned out rather well at that point. In the case of Singapore, there was no real concern. In the case of Indonesia, historically, we have no hidden agenda, nor do they with us. And with Thailand, well, Thailand is Thailand, and you have to get used to their neutral approach to things. And I think Prime Minister at that time, Anand Panjarachun, understood that. And he faulted me when I called on him, because he says, when President Aquino was president, he never called on me. What's the reason? Why don't you Filipinos like us? And I knew Kun Anand very well because he was on my board with IBM. And I said, we will be there, Mr. President. In fact, before my history, my memory that serves me right, the first country we went to was Thailand. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay, so that patched things up. And then going back to Philippine-American relations, let's face it, the relationship was very frosty at the beginning.
Exactly.
And the DOD, the Department of Defense, was really not very friendly towards us. And I called on them. I could only call on the deputy. And there was no warmth there at all. So finally he went, and it took a while, but they finally understood this was a president who was setting things straight. And I think, considering the circumstance, where all the crusty admirals and generals regretted that they couldn't even enjoy their good old days, it was a difficult situation. But that was resolved. Yes, we had to turn over Subic, and I was there with him, but I think that worked out. And as time worked out, that would have been fine. Unfortunately, things has changed differently now.
Tell me your perception, your insights of how he used foreign relations to the hilt as a tool for the country's interest. I mean, using it as his megaphone, so to speak.
I will tell you that we had one country where we did not have good relations, and I ended up the victim of that. But he handled it very well. He would call the head of state and talk to him and try to thresh it out. And I think that was the way to do it. To the point where he even asked that the ambassador here be sent home.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You know,
Right,
I mean, he had to take a tough stance, and that's what he did.
Mhm.
Despite the fact, and what really annoyed him was, somehow I'm not comfortable coming out further about why he was annoyed, because it's a bit difficult to explain.
Okay, okay.
That's
I
not
appreciate-
something that you want to say about a brother ASEAN country, no.
Oh, all right.
I will tell you that for me, that was the most traumatic event. As you know,
In your
I was
career.
the one that ended up, I made a statement, and the press will show this. At one point, at the height of the Contemplacion case,
Mhm.
I brought out the newspaper. I stood there, and the photographers, I wish I could get that copy. And I was front page saying, "The buck stops here."
Mhm.
Unfortunately, the buck did not stop with me. And as much as by the way, that's unique. There are cabinet secretaries in his office that would defend the president. Nobody has done that since. And at the end, I resigned.
Mhm.
And I think, and it's not because I didn't want to really resign. I love my job.
Mhm.
But in reality, you have to defend the president. And that's all there is. Because that's where the realm of politics is important, and not your own personal.
What was the exchange like between you and him at that time? You had conveyed your intention already to vacate your post, to resign?
Prior to that, I wrote a letter saying I'm ready to resign. Then he did not answer immediately. Then eventually he said, "Hey, I guess you're going to have to go." But long before that, probably 2 or 3 weeks before, I had written my letter of resignation. And he found it awkward because we never had any bad relations with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was an awkward thing. But he said, "I think you're going to have to go." So I accepted it at that point. And hindsight says maybe that wasn't really necessary. But, the senators, particularly one, was vocal and using
Early.
that as
You used
the
it
thing
to-
that would harm him,
Yeah,
and incidentally me and the Secretary of Labor.
yeah. So we were able to interview Secretary Nieves na rin actually.
Which wasn't necessary anymore.
Talaga?
It's like a month later.
Oo nga, after. Oo nga. But, well, it is what happened. Let me go to the way he changed the country's perception of the Philippines. Again, I go to ASEAN, and then let me bring in APEC.
No, let me give another insight. When he took office, I guess we were at an all-time low.
Yeah.
I was ambassador to Brussels, but then I became his secretary, and I was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos. And there was a period there where visiting dignitaries were asked to sit in the dining room table with around 10 other visitors and empty. And you wait for the attendees to attend. And the first year I went there, the only people who sat at my table were Filipinos,
Okay.
the Ayalas,
Yeah.
and what have you. No other. It was a terrible feeling. The next year, things had changed. There were foreigners coming. And the next year thereafter. And you could see that also in public sites, in what do you call this, forums that we would have.
Oh, yeah.
And you could see that things had turned around. In the context of ASEAN, you're asking, I didn't see. I think he was well received eventually. I'm not ready to comment further than that.
Yeah.
But I tell you, it was tough going in the beginning. Nobody would even, how it is, you're the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, nobody's sitting at your table. And fortunately, Jaime Gusto Sobel and Fernando Sobel comes and joins me. That's the only people that sat at my table.
But over the years,
It happened,
More-
then people would come.
So
That's not a
confidence
reflection on me. It's a reflection of their view of the Philippines.
on the country, right? So confidence was coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why, in the context of APEC, he said that he had a saying, which was concocted by me and Tommy Alcantara, that we're back in business,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he took APEC seriously,
Mm-hmm.
and he wanted to make sure that every person understood
Mm-hmm.
what APEC stood for.
Mm-hmm.
And he was there at the first meeting with President Clinton, and
Mhm.
I think he acquitted himself very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first one, 93, Blake Island.
Blake Island, yeah.
94, Bogor. 95, Osaka. 96,
Your
Manila.
memory is better than mine. Okay.
I was covering, sir. But that hosting people look back now and say it was the coming out party of the Philippines.
I forgot the hosting. What year was that?
96, Manila
96,
and
that's
Subic.
correct.
No?
Well, I was no longer foreign secretary, but I was the chairman of the APEC Business Advisory Council.
The founding
And-
chair.
and I worked hand in glove with the president to make sure it was a good event.
Mhm, mhm.
And it was. And one of the important things that came out of there, not just because of the president, because of the conformity of the leaders, was something to do with the ITA, the information technology, if
Mhm.
I'm not mistaken. Is that
Mhm.
right?
Exchange, yeah. Mhm.
That was the most significant that happened in APEC at that point in time.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure anything was as all-encompassing since then.
He had very strategic view of things, no? And people say that he was really many years ahead of
Yeah, well,
everyone.
he was always that. And I think because he had good advisors, not just me, many advisors,
Mhm.
and he was well-read as far as international affairs were concerned.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I credit a lot of his advisors for giving him the right input.
Mhm. Well, he also
He loved to get the input.
Mhm.
You never knew whether he'd accept it,
Mhm.
but he would absorb it and then cut and paste accordingly.
Right. He sought out a lot of. He was very engaging. No, he'd look for. He'd seek out advice. He'd seek out the information. And you're right. No, he didn't know if he used it.
You
but-
never knew.
Yeah. But eventually, you'd see bits and pieces of it in.
And then when he'd give you a copy of the speech, and you knew this guy here and this guy gave,
Mhm.
we look at it and then we look at each other. You gave that or did you give that? But he really just cut and paste.
Mhm.
But each time it came out solid as to what his position was.
Mhm.
Let me just say he was never namby-pamby about a position. It's either yes or no,
Right. Mhm.
and that was it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, as far as personnel, there's nothing I can say except he did the right thing as far as foreign affairs is concerned. I've watched him talk to his generals. But the way he talked to generals was entirely different than he talked to us,
Mhm. Civilians.
because he would remind them
Mhm.
he was his commander-in-chief.
Right. And those were the guys who understood what commander-in-chief really meant to. But he also had a knack for finding the right people, identifying the right
Yeah, he had a
talent
good captain.
for. Yeah?
You know, there's another interesting thing. He would set the scenario even when we would go on foreign trips.
Mhm.
He would say, Romulo, you stay here to my right, slightly behind. Navarro, your trade, you're here. And you too will be there.
Mhm.
And that was his backup for anything in foreign trips,
Mhm.
foreign affairs and trade.
Mhm.
And so Roya, Navarro, and I
Mhm.
worked very well together, unlike other DTI and DFA
Who were?
portions, which is always like World War II.
Mhm. Mhm.
But, you know, even when he's mad at us and there's photographers, he'll say in explicatives, smile, you know, and we're all smiling and he's bawling us out, you know.
But that was, yeah, give us a look into that character, the character, the your view from the inside. What was the man like? What was his work ethic like? What was his management style like?
His work ethic was unbelievable. If we were on a flight from one part of the world, like San Francisco to Washington, which is 6 hours flight, all the lights are out, going to sleep except one. He's working.
Oh,
4 in the morning, he'll call you up, even in Manila, or he'll send a fax. My God, the faxes we used to get, all in red, but sometimes we didn't have color at that time. But we would get messages left and right, you know. He really was on top of the situation. And his term of CSW, or complete staff work, we knew it, and we had to adhere to it. And when he held a meeting, the same story again. He knew what was going to be discussed. Frankly, I think he knew what was going to happen ahead. And he knew when to interrupt. And he knew, and you would see him talking to others during a presentation. Then he'd stop and ask a question, because he knew what the point was. So everybody was shocked. How could he have 2 conferences at the same time?
Multitasking.
But he was multitasking always. His work habit was unheralded at that time.
He was up at 4.
I guess.
Oh,
Sometimes
no.
I don't think he slept. You know, and then he would, those poor soldiers of his would go out and get the newspapers ahead of time. And he would have notes on it already before one of us were awake.
You would receive a
Yeah.
bunch
Or
of
else
those
he'd call
every
you.
day,
He'd call you.
aside from the daily identification of
Yeah.
the top 3.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I've never seen a president who took foreign affairs seriously like he did.
How did you find that work style? You were head of IBM before you joined the.
Well, I didn't find anything unusual about it. It's just his hours that drove me crazy.
But you appreciated that.
I
the
appreciate
drive,
that
the
sense
passion.
of, he has a sense of urgency, which is not readily evident sometimes in the Filipino culture.
Oh yeah, we like taking, you know.
Medyo bahala na, no?
But he was always running, literally.
I mean,
on
he
the
even
go.
forced me to play golf and make fun of me all the time, you know, because I was the worst golfer. But one time before an APEC meeting, we decided to play golf at 2 in the morning, because there's lights in Malacanang at that time. And we would have to play golf at that time. And then I would have a bad drive and go into the river. He said, "Oh, that's a good putt, Bobby." I mean, you know, he has a sense of humor also, at my expense, but nevertheless.
But those weren't exactly, if I remember those golf sessions, Secretary, they weren't exactly recreational. They were really a platform for him to, you ought to do this,
Well,
you ought to do that.
I started to play golf. He told me, "You better learn playing golf, because when I meet with foreign individuals, I have to have somebody there to know what we're discussing." So
Exactly.
whether I didn't like golf, I had to play, because I had to listen to what the conversations would be.
It was work for him.
Yeah.
It was
His mind was working all the time. Until he missed a putt, then he went, but.
and then there you go.
So I mean, there's many war stories that the others can tell you more. You should talk to Tommy Alcantara. He even has better stories.
Did we? Not yet.
Yeah. Well, Tommy hides in the woodworks. That's very hard. But if you can get him to talk, that's probably excellent. I'm sure you've talked to Joe Magno and those guys. But Alcantara would know.
How did he manage all those, CEOs, managing directors, all of you at the top of your game, how did he manage the egos,
Well,
the personalities?
Not really their egos, but he had to tell them it's your duty to help the country. And so we did it accordingly, because he gave you a sense of patriotism in his own unique way. Oh, Bobby, let's have a drink first. He'll give you a drink. Then he starts lecturing to you. So, He has a certain human aspect to him that's really quite engaging, although it seems stern. It really isn't.
Yeah, on the surface, no, he'd
Yeah.
seem very stiff, very stern. But
And there's
what was he
also
inside?
there's funny stories.
Yeah?
You know, he could fall asleep standing.
Okay.
You know, I mean, there's some funny stories there, but I won't tell you those stories. But he could be in the middle of the ballroom alone, and he'll have his cigar, and those of us knew he'd be taking a nap. Nobody else would know.
We kind of learned how to do that too on the C-130s. He eventually let go of you in '95 after the Contemplacion issue. But he didn't really let go of you. He kept you on the stable. You were with ABAC.
I went with him in almost all trips thereafter.
Exactly.
So
Part
no,
of the business community. And
So we worked together very well. He reluctantly, because of the political pressures, accepted my resignation. But I think he treated me well. He even gave me a good job after leaving. And as a result of that, I even got many more job offers. So I earned far more than when I was president of IBM. So in that sense, I'm also grateful to him.
where did he take us? You were there at the start, '92, when he came in, his foreign secretary. By the end of his term in '98, where were we insofar as Philippine foreign relations with the world was?
My opinion, it was considering the post-basis situation. It's as well as can be at that point in time. What happened afterwards, I will not. I dare not even comment. But during his term, everything was in the right path, as far as I'm concerned. And he was highly regarded. Even the Chinese, they asked him to be one of the founders of the ABAC Forum.
Forum, right. Oh, tell me about that, sir. I mean,
I don't know anything
No,
about
not Boao, but I mean Philippines-China relations. If you remember, and it was during your watch as well when you were there. These were, if you remember, the first incursions. We lost the air cover. We lost the naval cover afforded by the U.S. bases. China was flexing its muscles into the West Philippines.
We were cordial with each other in our first state visit. Then Mischief Reef come around. And as far as the Chinese side, I can only say that the Chinese side, after Mischief Reef, there was much suspicion on our part. But it was not, and I must suggest that at that point, the Americans were not too forthcoming, because they knew ahead of time, and they didn't tell us until. And Negroponte himself said, well, you know, we had these secret things that we could monitor, but they didn't want to reveal it at that time. I said, but we're your ally, why didn't you tell us? Well, after that, I think things have degenerated from the perspective of the American side. Because the American side, in my opinion, dropped the ball. That's at the end of Clinton and on to the next, all the way to Obama. They abdicated their strength and let the Chinese do what they want.
Right.
You know, and that's how it is at the moment. You can't blame the illustrious President Trump. It's not just his fumbling, but
it's previous.
even the pivot to Asia never worked. And they ignored Southeast Asia at some point. But that's a different story. That's separate.
Yeah. What do you want people to remember FVR as a public servant?
He made us proud to be Filipino, here and abroad. That is the most important thing a president can do in inspiring the people.
I'll end it at that. Thank you very much for your
Thank
time,
you.
sir. Maraming
Enjoy
salamat.
the-
Maraming salamat.